As we continue to discuss the cultural factors that impact multicultural teams, one of the key issues relates to what responsibilities leaders have in leading such teams to accomplish their goals. So in this episode, we're going to look at how our leadership styles are affected by our cultural intelligence. This is related to how those from different cultures respond to different styles of leadership and how culture affects how we make decisions.
Welcome to another of Dr. Phil's Leadership Matters podcast. In this series, Phil will be sharing from his decades of serving and leading multicultural teams from Africa to Eastern Europe to Latin America. Just click the link in the description box to download our free resources or the complete study guide. You can also access any of his other podcasts by going to icmcanada.org/leadershipmatters.
We all have a certain default leadership style, and yet we can learn to adjust this default approach according to the situation. This is all about situational leadership, isn't it? This is also the case for the leader of a multicultural team. There are many ways to define leadership styles, but there are two fundamental leadership styles. One focuses on getting the task done, and the other on relationships, making sure that everyone is getting along. Regardless of cultural issues, those who learn to focus on the relationships of those they lead tend to have healthier teams. Yet the very purpose of a team is that it is organized to accomplish common goals or tasks. It is these competing challenges that often complicate the process. Now, within multicultural teams, there's also the added dynamic that people from different cultures respond to task-oriented leadership in different ways. There's both formal leadership, which is based on position and title, and then informal leadership. Those which may not have position, but are nonetheless have influence in the respect of others. From a biblical perspective, a leader functioning as a servant should function with both of these. The reality, though, that is a multicultural team context, leadership organized around position and title may not be accepted by those with other cultural norms. So what happens is that an informal leader, without title or position, usually emerges. And they tend to be from the host culture. This is why it is so important for the leader to exercise the leadership style that reflects the values of those on their team and not alienate others by actions based on their own cultural norms. Of course, if they're not in their own host culture. A cultural intelligent leader uses a leadership style that is balanced between their own normal style, the cultural context of the team, and the demands of the tasks or situation. So instead of just reflecting the values of leadership from their own culture, they become aware of this dynamic and they learn to adjust. Ideally, they will base this on the kind of servant leadership based on Jesus' model of leadership. So now why not evaluate your own leadership style and determine how much of it is based on your own culture? And how do you need to learn to adapt? There are many ways to make decisions within a team, and if you want to take a deeper dive into that, you can download our team building section of our ministry guide workshops. Effective situational leadership means that we have to learn to adapt due to the context or the type of decisions being made. As with all areas, this too is impacted by each person's cultural values. Now, the typical rational or Western model of decision making begins with, number one, defining a problem. Then we produce a range of potential solutions. And then we apply systematic analysis to potential solutions to predict which will satisfy the predetermined criteria. And then finally, choosing and implementing the best alternative. Now, other approaches would include decisions based more on personality, family, consensus, tradition, position, connections, intuition, and so on. Now, while the rational approach to decision making is helpful, it is important to realize it is based on a cultural narrative founded upon values and assumptions that are typically reflected in the West. Of course, there are clear limitations to this model, such as the fact that criteria are not nearly as clearly defined as it would seem, and often there are competing criteria and values. Most decisions involve people, and so fitting them into such a rational model does not take the human element into consideration. In reality, leaders seldom so accurately define the problem or take all the factors into consideration or even understand all the potential and possible outcomes. So since this purely rational approach to decision making is oversimplistic, the reality is that all leaders, even in quote-unquote the rational West, implement other ways of making decisions. For example, they work incrementally, taking many small steps to a solution rather than a single all-encompassing big grand analysis. Or they create heuristics or simple rules of thumb, which may not be rational but simplify the decision-making process and can often be pretty accurate. They can also often choose a plausible alternative early on rather than continuing to pursue other alternatives. Or they may also procrastinate, panic, or avoid making decisions. There's lots of options when it comes to making decisions. These alternative methods of decision making are common across many cultures. So it's important to realize that culture puts limits on what is acceptable, and therefore what decisions can be implemented and how. In many cultures, how a decision is made is important as the decision itself and can ensure its success or failure. Leaders of multicultural teams need to be aware of their cultural bias in making decisions and be willing to look at the processes from cultural context of other team members. And we'll look more specifically at this application in upcoming episodes. What is your typical decision-making process? And how is this influenced by your own culture? As with most groups, teams create their own social dynamic, and this can actually undermine the potential of the group. For example, two such group dynamics that can be negative are groupthink and social loafing. Now, groupthink is a dynamic that occurs in teams as they overemphasize harmony and consensus and discourage dissenting views and any creative alternatives. Once consensus is achieved, all other debate or dissent becomes a kind of a question of loyalty. This never leads to the best solutions. Another social dynamic is what we call social loafing. Now, this occurs as members of the team put less effort into complete tasks as they think others will just compensate to get the job done. There's enough other people to do that. So they just kind of sit back and watch and not take any risks themselves, either failure or potential. And obviously, this also reduces the effectiveness of the whole team and not everybody reaching their potential. Our cultural values influence how we're affected by these two group dynamics. For example, those from more individualistic cultures will likely take a stand against groupthink. They don't like that, but are more likely to take advantage of social loafing. Now, every team leader needs to be aware of these dysfunctional dynamics of teams. However, leaders of multicultural teams have to be additionally aware that cultural differences between team members will also impact these dysfunctional processes. I want to take some time now to assess the interpersonal cohesiveness of your team. How can you mitigate these two social dynamics?
You can view or listen to any of Phil's other podcast series by going to icmcanada.org/leadershipmatters. These include Mentoring Intelligence, Finishing Our Race, the Fivefold Ministry, as well as a variety of other leadership series he has taught over the years. You could also check out our Christian Leadership Institute, which is a unique competency-based ministerial mentorship. To download any of our resources associated with these series, visit our library of materials at icm.org/resources.
Now, we've been discussing some of the social dynamics at play in all teams, but which are magnified in multicultural teams. While diversity can be a positive influence on the outcomes of a team, the reality is that those in the group that are further away culturally from the others tend to feel more negative about the group. Only by being proactive can the leader help them identify this and develop a unifying culture. On the upside, diverse groups within healthy team dynamics tend to be very productive and high-performing. Diversity provides a wider range of ideas and viewpoints, which makes the team healthier and more effective than what often occurs in homogeneous groups. Having differing perspectives can generate greater creativity, which is precisely what is needed in fulfilling the Great Commission, I would say, within an increasingly globalized world. But not all diversity is the same. As we have seen, cultures are on a continuum and so are not equidistant from each other. So the greater the difference, the more effort it takes by the leader and the other members to overcome these differences. We need to be aware of those on the team who feel most distanced from others. This is usually displayed by withdrawing and not participating. Hesselgrave outlines 7 areas of cultural divergence, such as worldview, cognitive process, linguistic form, behavioral patterns, social structure, media influence, and motivational influences. So while diversity provides a team with great potential for excellence, due to the cultural diversity and potential distances, the risks are also greater that the group may have difficulty in working together. So what about your team? Consider the cultural distance between team members, according to Hesselgrave's matrix. What are some of the things you can do to help to mitigate this? This brings us back to the issue of leadership, and more specifically, what we can do as leaders to help each member of a culturally diverse team reach their potential and be creative and productive. As we conclude this episode, I would like to mention 3 main things a culturally intelligent team leader can do to accomplish this. The first thing we need to do is to manage the environment. This begins by appreciating the differences and then being intentional in communicating this to the team. It is then important to provide rewards in a way that are culturally acceptable to each member. This will differ, for example, between individualistic and collectivistic societies. Now, this is a challenge in a diverse group, but effective groups agree upon appropriate individual and group awards, things that will be encouraged. It is also important for the leader to be aware of the values that each member places on the group. For some, group dynamics will be more important than for others. Another way for a team leader to provide motivation and synergy is to allow for as much self-management as possible. This is also helpful with diverse teams, though it should never undermine the cohesion and common goals of the team. Secondly, it's important to realize that teams take time to develop. From the early stages when members are just getting to know each other, through the various conflicts that inevitably arise, to the eventual establishment of common expectations and being able to effectively work together to fulfill a task. It is important to be aware that this process will likely take longer in multicultural teams due to the greater differences in expectations of how the group should work based on each member's cultural perspective. This becomes an additional challenge for the team leader and requires increasing one's own cultural intelligence to make this happen. And finally, the best way to take advantage of the cultural diversity of teams is to help increase the cultural intelligence of each team member. This means that the team leader needs to first learn these principles and then pass them on to others. This will include providing situations for team members to talk about their cultural values and background. Allowing for feedback ensures that every member feels that their voice is heard and connects them to the rest of the team. This can help each member be reflective and change their own narrative or scripts that have been detrimental to their team. So team leaders have several responsibilities then as they facilitate this. The first is to identify the current dynamics of the team, and then identify if the task of the team is simple, routine, or more complex. See, the leader needs to also recognize the degree of the cultural diversity on the team and the specific cultural issues that may produce conflict. And then finally, develop the processes necessary for dealing with the cross-cultural issues, ensure that all members participate regardless of their culture. Why don't you take some steps to develop a plan to increase the CQ or the cultural intelligence of your team members? Maybe think that through and provide that to them. Well, I know there's a lot here to chew on, but as the old saying goes, the only way to eat an elephant is just one bite at a time. As you're digesting this, let me encourage you to continue to make incremental steps in this direction. Next time we'll briefly consider how culture has impacted the expansion of the gospel message and some resultant factors that multicultural teams will have to deal with in pulling this off.
Thank you for listening to Leadership Matters and subscribing and sharing us. If you would like to have your own copy of this study, just click on the link in the description box. For any of our other leadership resources, check out our website, www.icmcanada.org/resources.